They turned on the tap and saw red water. The authorities said it was just rust. But the truth turned out to be much worse. Their son uncovered the secret they wanted to hide. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning sun had barely crested the line of cypress trees when George Harlow stepped out into the yard. His knees stiff from sleep, his mind already turning to the small routines that ordered his day. He had lived on this patch of land for more than 50 years, had laid the first stones of the house himself with the help of neighbors back when he was young and strong. The boards had grayed and weathered with time, but the house was still solid, still theirs, and it was where he and his wife Helen had built the quiet life they now clung to, like an anchor. He reached for the faucet near the side of the house, the one he used every morning to fill the battered metal watering can, and turned the handle until the old pipe groaned and spat. What poured out was not the clean, cool water he expected, but a murky stream the color of rusted iron. It splashed into the can thickly, leaving dark stains along the sides, and a sharp metallic smell rose into the warm air, heavy enough to make him take a step back. For a long moment he simply stared at it, confused, half expecting it to clear after a few seconds. But the stream remained the same deep, unsettling red, as though the faucet had been connected to some underground vein. Helen came outside moments later, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her gray hair pinned back in its usual tight bun. She was about to ask whether the tomatoes needed more watering in this heat when she caught sight of the liquid pooling at George's feet. Her breath caught in her throat. It looked like blood. Not bright, not fresh, but dark and old, as if drawn from some hidden wound in the earth. The sight made something cold pass through her chest. She felt suddenly smaller, frailer, as though the world had shifted a fraction to the side and left her standing in the shadow of something she could not name. George muttered that it must be rust in the pipes, but she could hear the unease in his voice. He shut off the tap quickly, and the last drip stained the dry soil a dull brown, where the dog sniffed at it and then backed away with a whine. Inside, the house felt close and still. They did not speak much as Helen made tea with the last of the bottled water from the pantry. They had always relied on their well and the old municipal line that fed into it, never questioning its purity. To see it fouled now seemed almost personal, like a betrayal of trust. By the time they sat down to breakfast, neither had much appetite left. George kept glancing at the window as though expecting to see the water running red across the yard by itself. Helen tried to busy herself with the little tasks of the day, dusting shelves and folding laundry. But the image of that crimson stream would not leave her mind. She felt as though it had seeped into the house somehow, into the very air, tainting everything she touched. By late morning, they had decided they could not simply ignore it. George suggested they wait a day or two, see if it cleared on its own, but Helen would not have it. She felt something pressing on her, an urgency that went beyond reason. So they changed into their Sunday clothes, the ones they wore whenever they had to go into town, and walked slowly down the road toward the center of the community. The town hall was a squat brick building with a single flag snapping in the hot wind. Inside it smelled of dust and paper and floor polish, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Behind a counter sat a young clerk with tired eyes who barely looked up as they approached. Helen tried to explain the problem, her voice quavering despite her best efforts to sound calm. She told them about the color, the smell, the strange heaviness in the water. The clerk nodded politely, filled out a slip, and assured them that a technician would be sent within the week. George pressed for something sooner, but the clerk only smiled that practiced bureaucratic smile and said the schedule was full. They left feeling smaller than when they had arrived. Walking back home under the heavy sun, they spoke little. George's jaw was tight, his steps slow and deliberate. Helen felt a weight in her chest that no breeze could cool. By the time they reached the house, the yard seemed somehow different, as if it had been watching them leave and was now waiting for them to return. The faucet stood there like a threat. George tried it once more, just to see, and the water gushed out as red as ever, leaving streaks on the ground. He turned it off with a curse he rarely used and kicked at the dirt, but the act gave him no relief. That night, neither of them slept well. Helen lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant whine of cicadas, and thinking about the neighbors who might also be drinking the same water without knowing what was in it. She wondered if the red color meant poison, if they had been poisoning themselves for days without realizing. She thought of the children down the road, of the gardens that lined every backyard, of the old men who came to drink from their hoses in the heat of summer. Her heart beat hard against her ribs until she turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin like a child afraid of the dark. The next morning they discovered the problem had not faded. The water ran even darker, thicker, and now there was a slick film on the surface that shimmered in the light like oil. The smell was worse, metallic and chemical all at once, catching in their throats. Helen refused to use it even to wash her hands. She fetched a bucket of stored rainwater for her flowers instead. But even as she poured it, she kept glancing at the faucet as though expecting it to leap to life. That afternoon they heard from a neighbor that her little boy had broken out in a rash after his bath. Another family said their drinking water had tasted bitter for days. The talk spread from porch to porch, growing quieter as the fear set in. People said maybe it was just rust. Maybe a burst pipe had stirred up sediment. Others whispered that something was wrong upstream, that someone was dumping waste into the old water line again, like they used to do decades ago before the plant was shut down. The uncertainty made it worse. By evening, George's patience had worn thin. He sat on the porch staring at the horizon, his hands clasped between his knees, while Helen busied herself with wiping the kitchen counters, though they were already spotless. There was an edge in the air, an unspoken sense that they were waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Only the faint smell of iron wafting from the yard. When night fell, the house felt more like a trap than a refuge. George rose several times, going to the window to stare out into the darkness, half tempted to try the faucet again, just to see. But each time Helen stopped him. The thought of hearing that rusty gush in the middle of the night was too much for her. On the third day, the situation became unbearable. The garden began to wither from lack of watering, and the store of bottled water grew dangerously low. Helen washed dishes in the little rainwater that remained in the barrel. They avoided bathing, avoided even brushing their teeth with the tainted water. The house felt as though it were under siege, their routines disrupted, their comfort stripped away. George finally said they could not wait any longer for the town's promise of a technician next week. Something was wrong beyond ordinary rust. The color, the smell, the film, it all spoke of contamination. He looked at his wife, saw the exhaustion in her face, the fear behind her eyes, and felt his own resolve harden. If the town would not act, they would have to find someone who would. That night the two of them sat together at the kitchen table, the single lamp casting a pool of yellow light around them while the rest of the house lay in shadow. Helen clasped her hands, twisting them until the knuckles whitened. George said little, staring at the grain of the wooden table as though the answer might appear there. At last Helen rose, walked slowly to the phone that hung on the wall, and stood there for a long moment before taking it down. Her fingers hovered over the numbers, hesitant, and then she dialed the one person she knew might take them seriously. The call rang long and slow, the sound filling the quiet house. When at last a voice answered, she drew a deep breath and began to explain. The decision to involve their son would mark the true beginning of the ordeal, though neither of them could have known it then. As Helen spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush, George looked toward the darkened yard through the window. The faucet glinted faintly in the moonlight, like an accusing eye. Somewhere in the night a dog barked, sharp and quick, then fell silent. The house seemed to hold its breath as the first threads of a much larger story began to tighten around them. The phone call that Helen had placed the night before still echoed in the house, as if her words had not stopped traveling, as if they lingered in the very walls. The morning light was gray and hesitant, casting long stripes across the worn kitchen floor. George sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cold mug, staring at nothing in particular. The faucet outside remained untouched, but its presence was heavy, like a warning. When the phone rang again just after sunrise, both of them jumped. Helen rushed to answer, her heart thudding against her ribs, and when she heard her son's calm, familiar voice, a mixture of relief and shame swept through her. She had not wanted to bother him with old people's worries, but now that he was on the line, she could no longer hold back the torrent of details. She described the water, its color and smell, the oily sheen, the neighbors' rashes and stomach complaints, the town hall's dismissive response. On the other end, Mark listened silently, and when he finally spoke, his voice was no longer casual. It was clipped, focused, the voice of someone who had shifted from son to professional in an instant. He told her to stay calm, to avoid using the water at all costs, and to expect that he might call again at odd hours. Then he hung up, leaving behind a silence that felt both frightening and reassuring at once. Mark's apartment in the capital was small, lined with shelves of equipment and books, the glow of multiple monitors throwing pale light into the dark room. He sat down at his desk, pulling his chair close until his knees bumped against the drawers, and began to work. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the secured networks he had clearance for. The first searches were general municipal water quality reports, infrastructure maintenance logs, and public advisories. But nothing appeared that could explain what his parents had described. The system claimed that water in their parish had passed routine inspections only a month earlier. The numbers were clean, the results well within safety limits. Mark frowned and dug deeper, shifting to restricted files, running queries that pulled up internal correspondence between the local water management authority and the regional office. That was when he saw it. A flagged incident report dated 3 weeks ago, describing an unexplained spike in chemical compounds, iron content, and pH imbalance in the supply line that fed the neighborhood where his parents lived. The report ended with the notation pending further review, but there was no follow-up file. Someone had stopped the investigation midway. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, then leaned forward again, his jaw set. He pulled up maps of the old water grid and traced the flow lines that ran beneath the town. They were ancient, some dating back to the 1940s, barely maintained except when they burst. He found digital schematics showing feeder lines from an industrial zone that had been declared inactive years ago. Curious, he ran a search on property records for that zone and discovered that one of the warehouses had recently been leased to a scrap metal processing company that officially did not exist in any business registry. There were no tax filings, no safety inspections, no environmental permits. It was as though the place had been set up deliberately in the shadows, meant to operate unnoticed. His stomach nodded as the pieces began to fall into place. If the water was running red, it was not just rust. It meant runoff chemicals, possibly solvents, maybe acids entering the waterline through illegal discharge points. He switched windows and began combing through internal emails flagged for environmental compliance. Soon he found exchanges between local officials, coded in bureaucratic language but clear enough for someone who knew what to look for. They referenced temporary allowances, expedited approvals, and even donor considerations. There were signatures at the bottom, names of council members and utility supervisors, all agreeing to defer official testing and avoid reporting the anomalies until after the quarter review. Mark's mouth tightened. It was bribery dressed up as administrative convenience. Someone had been paid to look the other way, while waste was dumped into the ground and into the pipes that fed people's homes. The thought of his parents drinking that water, of the children playing in yards nearby, made his pulse quicken. He opened an encrypted channel to his government contact in the Department of Infrastructure Oversight, attaching the files he had found along with his own analysis. He added a personal note at the end, emphasizing that his parents lived in the affected zone and that delay could cost lives. Then he waited, the minutes dragging by, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. When the reply finally came, it was short but decisive. His report had been escalated to emergency status, and a federal response team was being organized. Mark exhaled slowly, relief washing through him, but quickly followed by a new tension. This was no longer a local problem. It was about to become a case that could draw national attention, and that meant there would be powerful people, who would not be pleased. Back in the small house in St. Martin Parish, the hours passed heavily. Helen moved through the rooms with restless hands, dusting the same shelves twice, folding and refolding the towels in the linen closet. George sat on the porch staring at the dirt road, his face set like stone. The faucet outside remained dry, as though they feared to touch it and summon whatever poison still lurked in its pipes. When the phone rang again near dusk, Mark's voice was firmer, more urgent. He told them that they were right to be worried, that something illegal was happening in their water supply, and that help was on the way. He instructed them not to speak of this to neighbors just yet, not until inspectors arrived. Helen nodded even though he could not see her, her free hand clutching the edge of the counter until her knuckles ached. George listened from the doorway, and though he said nothing, his shoulders loosened slightly. For the first time in days, there was a sense that someone was taking them seriously. That night, the house did not feel quite as suffocating. They still avoided the tap, still relied on the last jugs of water they had stored, but there was a fragile hope now, a belief that the nightmare might end. Still, Helen found it hard to sleep. She lay awake listening to the faint creaks of the house, the distant hum of insects outside, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Her mind kept returning to Mark, picturing him in front of his glowing screens, sifting through data, tracing hidden lines of corruption. She worried for him, for the risk he might be taking. George, lying beside her, thought not of data, but of the men whose signatures were on those papers. Men he had seen at town meetings and barbecues. Men who had shaken his hand and called him neighbor. The betrayal gnawed at him, a slow fire building in his chest. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the curtains, both he and Helen were awake, waiting, listening for whatever might come next. The following morning brought with it a strange stillness, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The air was humid, the sky a dull pewter, promising rain but offering none. George stepped out onto the porch and looked down the road, half expecting to see nothing at all. Instead, far in the distance, he saw a glint of metal, the shape of a dark vehicle turning onto their lane. He called for Helen, and together they watched as a government car rolled closer, dust rising in its wake. Their hearts pounded in unison. The moment they had been waiting for had arrived. The dark government car was only the first. By mid-morning, more vehicles began to appear, one after another, until the quiet road in front of the Harlow house looked like the staging ground for an operation. Helen stood at the front window, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, while George remained on the porch as though unwilling to retreat even as the engines idled and the dust settled over the grass. The men who stepped out were not from the town. She could see that at a glance. Their uniforms were clean and dark, their boots polished, their movements brisk and precise. They were followed by technicians in pale protective suits who carried cases marked with warning symbols, and when they began unloading equipment, strange cylinders, sampling kits, a portable generator, Helen's stomach knotted. This was no simple inspection. Whatever Mark had told them had stirred up something far bigger than a broken pipe. Neighbors began to drift toward the road, first one or two, then more, curious and uneasy, whispering among themselves. A state official with a clipboard spoke briefly to the cluster of onlookers and gestured for them to stay back. When two officers began stringing bright yellow tape across the entrance to the lane, the murmur of voices rose in protest, but no one dared cross the line. George finally came down the porch steps and stood with his arms folded as a man in a dark jacket approached him, identified himself as a federal investigator, and explained that the area was under immediate review. They would need to test the water sources, dig near the pipes, and possibly shut down the supply for several days. George nodded stiffly and stepped aside, watching as they spread out across the yard with a kind of grim choreography. The first sound of metal against earth made Helen flinch. A pair of workers dug near the faucet, scooping out shovelfuls of damp soil, placing them carefully into containers. Others flushed the line, filling glass vials with the liquid that gushed forth. The smell was overpowering when the water hit the sunlight, a heavy metallic reek mixed with something chemical and bitter. One of the technicians wrinkled his nose even through his mask and sealed the sample quickly. Within minutes, a portable testing unit was humming, its small screen glowing as the readings appeared. Helen could not see the numbers, but she saw the man's face change, his brow furrow, his lips tighten as he called another over. They spoke in low voices before hurrying back toward the official car. A second team moved toward the back of the property, unspooling cables and setting up ground-penetrating radar to trace the underground flow. The yard that had once been the couple's sanctuary now looked like a construction site, machines whirring, boots crunching, voices calling out. When the water line was shut off entirely, The neighbors began to grumble. Mothers worried aloud about bathing their children. Elderly men asked where they were supposed to get drinking water. But then a truck arrived, its sides emblazoned with the seal of the state emergency services, and workers began unloading large drums of clean water, setting them along the road for distribution. It was both a relief and a confirmation that the situation was serious. Helen stood on the porch steps with her arms wrapped around herself, listening to the hiss of pressurized hoses as more samples were drawn. She felt exposed, as though every secret in their quiet life had been dragged into the open along with the poisoned water. By afternoon, the team had traced the contamination back through the feeder pipes. George followed them at a distance as they crossed into the overgrown field behind the property, where rusting chain-link fences marked the edge of the disused industrial zone. The gate was chained but not locked, and the investigators pushed it open, their boots crunching on broken glass. Beyond the gate stood the shells of old buildings, roofs sagging, windows boarded or shattered, the air heavy with the smell of rust and weeds. At the far corner of one warehouse, they found what they had suspected: an illegal discharge pipe protruding from the foundation, trickling a dark, viscous liquid into the ground. The soil around it was stained red-brown, the grass long dead. One of the men crouched to take a sample, and when he stood again, his expression was grim. They had found the source. Word traveled quickly among the team, and soon radios were crackling, summoning additional units. A police car arrived, then another, and before long the site was ringed with flashing lights. Inside the warehouse, they found evidence of recent activity footprints in the dust, barrels stacked in neat rows, a makeshift workstation with chemical containers still uncapped. It was not simply an abandoned building. It was an active operation, hidden in plain sight. Helen and George, kept at a distance by the cordon, watched as officers photographed everything, marked evidence, and spoke into their radios. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing hour, when a pair of handcuffed men were led out of the building and into the waiting patrol cars. A shiver passed through the small crowd of neighbors gathered at the tape. Someone muttered a prayer, someone else cursed under their breath. It was as if the town itself had been caught doing something shameful. As dusk approached, portable floodlights were set up around the site, bathing the field in a harsh white glow. The officials showed no sign of leaving. Trucks came and went, carrying away barrels under heavy tarps. Helen prepared a simple meal inside the house, but neither she nor George had much appetite. They ate in silence, the faint thrum of generators and distant voices filtering through the open window. From time to time, Helen caught her husband's eye and saw in it the same mixture of anger and weary vindication she felt herself. They had been right not to ignore the red water. They had been right to insist something was wrong. And yet the sight of their yard turned into a staging ground filled her with a hollow ache. This was their home, their refuge, and now it was part of an unfolding scandal. That night, sleep did not come easily. The lights outside cast strange shadows across the ceiling, and the sound of vehicles coming and going kept them half awake. Helen lay on her side, listening to the low hum of radios and the occasional shout of a command. She thought of Mark, imagined him far away in his apartment, following the updates, waiting for her call. She wanted to tell him what was happening, that the authorities had come, that arrests had been made, but she also wanted to shield him, to let him sleep without the burden she carried. George rose once and went to the window, standing there a long time watching the silhouettes moving against the lights. When he returned to bed, he said nothing, but Helen felt the weight of his thoughts in the mattress beside her. Morning brought a fresh round of activity. More vehicles appeared, this time with the insignia of environmental agencies. Workers in thicker suits began the slow process of removing contaminated soil, shoveling it into lined containers, and loading them onto trucks. The air was thick with the smell of earth and chemicals. At one point, an official came to the porch to speak with them, explaining that the contamination was severe but contained. They would continue to work until the site was secure. Helen nodded, her hands twisting together. She felt both gratitude and dread gratitude that they were no longer alone, dread at the realization of how close they had come to real disaster. By late afternoon, the once quiet road was crowded with news vans, cameras pointed at the house, reporters speaking urgently into microphones. The story had broken. People wanted to know how long the dumping had been going on, how many had been affected, who had known and done nothing. Helen watched from behind the curtains, her heart thudding. She did not want to be interviewed, did not want her face on the news, but she knew this was bigger than her fear. George sat on the porch, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. A silent sentinel as the town's shame and anger began to boil. When darkness fell again, the lights stayed on in the field, and the sound of engines rumbled long into the night. Helen could not shake the image of the dead grass around the pipe, of the stained soil that had poisoned their water. She lay awake once more, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pulse of the machines through the ground. The ordeal was far from over. The authorities might have found the source, but the damage lingered, not just in the water, but in the trust that had been broken. Tomorrow, she thought, they would come to speak to her again, to take more statements, to assure them that the water would soon be clean. But tonight all she could feel was the weight of everything they had learned, and the unsettling knowledge that the world outside their door would never again be quite as simple as it had been. The morning after the arrest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though the land itself were pausing between heartbeats. The bright floodlights that had burned through the night were gone, leaving the field in shadow once more. Trucks still rumbled now and then as they carried away the last barrels of contaminated soil, but the frantic edge had passed. What remained was the slow, methodical work of restoring what had been damaged. George stood at the edge of the porch, looking out over the yard that had been torn open by shovels and machinery. Where the grass had once been green and soft, there were now deep furrows and mounds of fresh earth. The faucet still stood, silent and capped, as though in mourning. Helen joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. The air was damp and cool, and a faint smell of disinfectant drifted from the field beyond. It clung to everything like a reminder that the ground had been sick and was still healing. Over the next several days, the hum of work became their new background music. Excavators came and went. Workers en masse replaced pipes, sealed joints, laid down new filtration units. The noise was constant but strangely reassuring, like the sound of a surgeon's instruments in the operating room. It meant the wound was being cleaned, stitched, made whole again. Helen brought the men jugs of clean water from the supply truck, grateful that someone was finally caring for the land she had always tended so lovingly. George stayed close, watching every move as though his presence might keep them from cutting corners. They were polite, even kind, explaining what they were doing whenever asked. By the end of the week, the new pipes gleamed faintly where the earth had been opened. When the day finally came for the water to be turned back on, an inspector stood by with a clipboard, his expression serious. The faucet sputtered at first, then released a stream of clear, cold water that sparkled in the sun. Helen felt tears sting her eyes. She cupped her hands under the flow and let it run over her palms, then took a cautious sip. It tasted clean, almost sweet, and she passed the water to George, who drank deeply before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. For the first time in weeks, there was no metallic aftertaste, no film left behind on the skin. The relief was so strong it made them both laugh softly, a strange broken sound that carried a little of their exhaustion with it. But the restoration of the water did not erase what had happened. The neighbors still gathered at the end of the lane, talking in low voices, watching the last of the trucks leave. Some nodded at George and Helen with gratitude. Others avoided their eyes as though blaming them for bringing trouble to light. Helen felt their stares like weight pressing on her back whenever she walked to the mailbox. The small town was not used to scandal, and though they all had been drinking the same poisoned water, there was a part of them that resented the disruption, the attention from reporters, the presence of police and government inspectors. Helen tried to hold her head high, telling herself that they had done what had to be done, but late at night, when she lay awake, she wondered whether life would ever return to what it had been before. There was no returning to the simple days of tending the garden without glancing at the faucet, of filling the kettle without suspicion. The innocence had been stripped away. Mark called every evening for the next week, checking on his parents, making sure the officials were keeping their promises. His voice was tired but warm, He told them that the evidence they had gathered was being used to prosecute several local officials for corruption and criminal negligence. The illegal scrap operation had been shut down permanently, its owners facing charges that could put them behind bars for years. Helen listened with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew this meant Mark had placed himself in the center of a political storm. He downplayed the danger, but there was a gravity in his tone when he warned them not to discuss the details with anyone who came asking questions, especially strangers. George thanked him quietly and promised to keep the house locked at night. As the weeks passed, the work crews finished their tasks and the heavy machinery left the road. The yard was leveled, reseeded, though the grass would take time to grow back. The industrial site beyond the field was sealed off with new fencing, and warning signs were posted along the perimeter. For the first time in years, the town council scheduled open meetings to discuss infrastructure repairs, and attendance was higher than anyone could remember. People who had once stayed silent now stood and demanded accountability. Helen watched these changes with a strange sense of detachment, as though she had started an avalanche she could no longer control. When a journalist stopped by one afternoon to ask for a comment, she politely declined and closed the door, unwilling to have her face turned into a symbol for something so much larger than her own fear and survival. One evening near the end of summer, when the sky was painted gold and the air was heavy with the smell of warm earth, Helen filled 2 glasses of water and carried them out to the porch. George was sitting in his usual place, the dog at his feet, the porch bathed in soft light. She handed him a glass and sat beside him. They drank slowly, savoring the simple act. Beyond the yard, the field lay quiet, the new fence gleaming faintly in the setting sun. It was peaceful again, almost too peaceful, as if the land had grown tired of conflict and settled back into itself. But Helen knew better. Beneath the calm lay memory of the days when the water had run red, when fear had curled cold in her stomach, when they had sat awake through the night listening for the sound of engines bringing salvation or disaster. She reached for George's hand and he took it, their fingers clasping with the silent understanding of 2 people who had survived something that would mark them forever. They did not speak for a long time. The cicadas began to sing. The first stars blinked into view. Somewhere down the road a car door slammed and a screen door creaked, the ordinary sounds of life returning. Yet even as they sat there, Helen knew that the ordinary would never mean quite the same thing again. The water was clear now, but she would never again turn on the faucet without thinking of that first shocking morning, of the crimson stream that had gushed into their lives and forced them to act. The town might forget, the neighbors might eventually stop whispering, but she would remember. And she hoped that memory would be enough to keep everyone honest, to keep the officials awake at night knowing that someone might notice, might speak, might refuse to be ignored. As the last light faded, Helen raised her glass one final time and drank, the cool water sliding down her throat like a benediction. The world was quiet, the danger gone, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the relief, there was still a tremor of vigilance. The earth might heal, the pipes might stay clean, but the knowledge remained that poison could creep in again if no one watched. It was a sobering thought, but it made her grip George's hand more tightly. Together they sat, staring into the gathering night. Guardians now not just of their home, but of the truth they had uncovered, determined that silence would never again be the easy choice. If this story kept you watching until the very end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos. There are more stories waiting for you right now. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.